So you're not renewing your local subscriptions. No, we spend all our money going over to see the big show.
I'm not
it's a real problem.
In the big shows, but I enjoyed Les Mis, but that was
right.
the extent of it. Well, most of them are pretty spectacles, and I'd much rather see a more intimate thing. But I guess I'm in the minority.
No, I remember we went to see Showboat in Toronto, and the next day we went to see Mrs. Klein at the Tarragon Theatre. Small cast, wonderful production. I remember we looked at one another and said, Showboat was great, but this was just as marvelous to see 3 or 4 good actors in a good play. Well, I'll shut up and let you...
Well, not for long, though, hopefully.
Okay, anyway, it gives me a bit of a feeling of warm-up.
I'll start with a quote, is more philosophical, I guess, than anything, but we must remember that National Theatre grows out of community theatre, which is something that you obviously believe.
Oh, definitely. Well, there was no way that it couldn't, and when we were starting out, of course, it was all the small amateur and community theatres all across Canada, and everything. Even Stratford, of course, drew on those actors who got their training in places as far removed as the Maritimes and Victoria and Vancouver.
You spent some time with Dorothy Somerset.
Yes.
Can you tell me a little bit about her and what she meant, both, I guess, to you and to the theatre?
Well, I don't want to go on for too long about it, but Dorothy came into my life in 1942. She used to go around and talk at schools and go to communities all through BC on her own. And she came to my high school, North Van High, and gave a little lecture about theatre and demonstrations on the use of props and things like that. Well, I grabbed her on the way out, and she said, well, come out to the university and see me. And I went out there, and she gave me books to read and things like that. And that was the beginning when I was only, 16, 17. And then, of course, later, I got to know her by seeing productions she did at the university. Very ambitious things like Ascent of F6 and Cocteau's The Infernal Machine. She was doing, plays that were really a revelation. And then, of course, she was the whole thing behind the development of the theatre department and the Frederick Wood Theatre. And so I got to know her pretty well, particularly when I was doing shows at the Freddie Wood, directing and acting, and with Holiday Theatre with Joy, because it was all linked together.
What would you say her main contribution was to theatre in development?
Well, I think it was just this tremendous dedication to not just the theatre, but to getting the word out about theatre all throughout the province. She had little model sets built, and she'd travel with 2 suitcases on the old trains going from town to town. And she told me all about the adventures, including being picked up by traveling salesmen and things like this. But, it was just her life. And the only funny thing I can say with her, of course, was when the old Freddie Wood, which was a Quonset hut setup, was built. It was just like her living room. And she'd go around polishing the floors and dusting the furniture on the sets, even when you didn't want it dusted. And if you put a tack in the wall, she'd say, "Oh, don't put a tack in the wall. Just use a little Scotch tape." It was this wonderfully protective thing. But she was so great, and I'm sure so many of us owe so much to her, including Sidney Risk, of course, who very often during his early years taught out there and worked with her, and his only salary was earned through teaching. And Dorothy was behind all that, too.
Let's talk about Sidney still around, and
yeah.
He was involved, I guess. Were they both involved in the Players Club, or was it most...
I'm not certain about that. They may have been. I think maybe not Sidney, because I think he came from Alberta. And I'm not sure exactly when he came to Vancouver. I know that he was busy with the Everyman Theatre when I was graduating in 1947 from the Pasadena Playhouse in California. And I wrote a letter of application, "Dear Mr. Risk, I'll even push a broom. I just want to be a member of the Everyman Theatre." And later on, when I finally got to know him in Vancouver and worked with the Everyman Theatre, I said, "You never replied to my letter." And we went through the files, and I found I didn't sign the letter or put my address on it. But there's a lovely letter of application 2 years before. But when we finally did get together, of course, it was just great. And I had a wonderful year with Sydney, with the Everyman Theatre, when they had their small studio theatre up on Main Street near 7th and Main, and Joy Coghill was there, and John Milligan, and Myra Benson, and it was fabulous. We were doing 7 shows in repertory, a different show every night, plus kids' matinees. Absolutely ridiculous. We used to sleep there overnight because there wasn't time to go home in between changing sets and performing and directing. But there was this tremendous dedication there, and of course so many of the people involved are still around. Sydney unfortunately isn't, but he again was a catalyst for all of us.
How would you describe him as a director?
He was very good. He was a very quiet director, not aggressive particularly, as far as I remember. But very meticulous about what he did. And very quiet and very easy to talk with, very sensitive as a director. They're all different, or we're all different. But his approach, as I remember, was that. And again, there was always a space on the floor at his apartment if you had to sleep overnight or anything like that, And the coffee pot was always on.
How would you describe the theatre space on Main? Was it a challenging one for him?
Oh, very. It's rather odd because briefly I tried to organize what was called the Vancouver Opera Theatre, and we did a production of The Magic Flute, first opera by Mozart done in Vancouver. This was around 1951 when I first came back after another trip to California. But anyway, we found this space up on the second floor over a Chinese grocery shop, and it had been a dance hall or something. Anyway, we had it for rehearsal, and we used to hold Saturday night dances to raise our rent. We'd invite people from all the different companies in Vancouver to come and have a social evening together. It was like a little bit before Yvonne Firkin started the Arts Club, but we were trying to do the same thing and raise our rent. Anyway, one day John Milligan, who was with the Everyman, came knocking at the door, and I went downstairs, and he said, "Oh." I said, "Yes, I've got this space." Anyway, the next year, I wasn't going to do any more operas, and so it sort of all amalgamated in a very friendly way, including the people I was working with who joined with the Everyman.
So that was your first experience with the Everyman, was when they...
That's right. And all of a sudden we were in that space, and a lot of the actors and singers from my group were working with Sydney's group, and we managed to build risers and get folding chairs in. And I don't know whether we had 100 seats or 60 seats, very small, and no backstage space at all. Had a kitchen, but we used to have to, there was an attic way up, and had a big opening that could be pulled open, and we'd pull all the scenery from one show up into the attic and lower all the stuff for the next night down onto the stage for the following performance. That was it.
Did that ever cause any problems, or was it
only when things went a little wild in some of the shows, and we had the tenants below in the grocery shop running up the stairs saying, "The plaster's all coming down over our vegetables. Can you please be a little less rough upstairs?" That's about what I remember of that.
Was it about the same time that you were began your involvement with Tuts, or where did that happen?
Well, Tuts was even earlier, and Sam Payne was got me into Theatre Under the Stars in 1945, the year I graduated from high school, and I got into Riorita, which ran for a week, and was paid $15 for one role and $10 for the other, a total of $25 to play two roles in Riorita back to back. And a Mexican bandit and a Mexican police officer. I had 3 minutes to change costume and makeup, and that was rehearsals plus performances, total 25. But you had to have parents who supported you in those days. But anyway, that was the beginning, and then I went away to study for 2 years, and then I came back and was involved in 1948, which was a wonderful season when we did Florodora with Ed McCurdy, a wonderful folk singer, actor type, and Bill Buckingham was in it, and Evie Young was in it, and I can't remember who directed. I think Bill directed it, yeah, because he wasn't supposed to be in it, but Evie got a heart attack, and Bill Buckingham had to take over Evie Young's role, and they tossed two of Evie Young's big songs at me because we couldn't learn it all in 24 hours. So we sort of split the effort. And of course, in those days, in 48 and even before, they used to tour over to Victoria and perform in Central Park in the open air with Boy Scouts holding up the scenery against the wind. It was true. And they used to go to Seattle and Portland. It was amazing what they were doing at that time. But of course, at that time, it was run by Gordon Hilker. It was before Bill Buckingham became the artistic director.
What do you remember of Gordon? What's your impression and memories of him?
He was certainly well organized, and of course, Hugh Pickett, and he had, Hugh Pickett, I think, learned his business working for Hilker Attractions, because Gordon Hilker's father had Hilker Attractions, and when we were all very, very young, we used to go and see all the wonderful concerts that came to town. You know, everybody from Fritz Kreisler to Rachmaninoff, and that was all Hilker Attractions. And then his son Gordon took over and eventually became the, I guess you'd call him the general manager of Theatre Under the Stars. And then eventually Bill Buckingham replaced him, rather reluctantly, because Bill was an actor. Well, he'd been a lawyer, but he'd always been an actor, like most lawyers. And I remember he was very, very unhappy about the idea of being stuck behind a desk when he wanted to be on stage. And when we were rehearsing during Bill's years, I'm talking 50s now, I do jump about, but anyway, Bill's office door opened onto the rehearsal hall, and he'd sit behind his desk watching the rehearsals and looking rather unhappily at all the paperwork on his table.
Someone else who you have fond memories of is Evie Young.
Oh, very much.
What he meant to you and what he did for you. And,
yeah.
Maybe talk about that.
Well, of course, I'd seen him on stage from when I was a teenager, and later, from the 1950 period, when he was still directing and I was acting, he lived in North Vancouver, and so did I, and we used to come home on the ferry after rehearsals, the old ferry, and Evie, of course, he was very big in radio, particularly with religious readings, had the most beautiful voice, and had acted with Sybil Thorndike when they were very, very young in England before he ever came to North America. But anyway, we used to chat coming home, and Evie once said, he said, you know, I don't know how many years I've got left, but, you know, if I ever leave Tuts, I would love you to be a director there. And I was thrilled. And when he was directing later, he was terribly good because he knew I wanted to be a director, so he'd give me short dialogue scenes between the big musical show numbers and say, well, would you take those actors out, just work with them in the hall for a while? Because I was thrilled. I was about, 22 at the time, and just the chance to do it was so important. There was no jealousy in him about it. And of course, we were all so sad when he died. Of course, I guess we sort of expected it from the heart attack period back in '48, and then he eventually did die. And I was absolutely amazed when his son phoned me and said, would you be one of the pallbearers at Christchurch Cathedral for Evie's funeral? And I thought, my God, I'm getting goosebumps right now remembering that they should consider me that much, because the family didn't know me. So there was just something there between an old director and a young one coming up that was very simpatico.
I just lost my thought there, but I was going to ask you about. Oh God, you got me so enthralled. Well, you did mention on it, I guess. Oh yeah, that was what it was. The fact that you were doing, 6 plays in 7 weeks and that kind of repertoire.
Oh yes.
It was interesting to talk about the fact that your rehearsals would be like to 3:34 in the morning, and
Well, it was on the weekends. You'd end, say, Sweethearts on Saturday night around 10:30 or 11, and then they'd strike the sets and change all the lighting and put up the sets for the following week's musical. And there'd be about a 2-hour wait while you had hamburgers and coffee and tried to keep warm. And the reason, of course, was that there was no point in trying to rehearse in the middle of Stanley Park on a Sunday afternoon, because thousands of people would be staring at you. So the idea was to do the rehearsal at night and then rest on Sunday and open on Monday. And it was often pretty hilarious and very cold down in the park, and often very wet. And I must say there was a great deal of dosed with rum coffee thermoses going around. I remember being quite shocked when I was still a teenager when Barney Potts and Harry Price and 2 or 3 other old-timers at Tut said, you must be freezing out there. Come in and have a cup of coffee. And they poured me this great big mug of coffee, and wow, it was about 50% rum. It kept you warm. Nobody ever got high on it, but I think it sustained them. And then, you'd be through as the dawn came up. You'd be finishing your rehearsal. And thinking back to E.V. Young for a moment, when he did a production of The Great Waltz, Dorothy did one too, but an earlier one by E.V. Young. They used to get a lot of stars from New York or from Los Angeles, and sometimes it would be somebody that Bill Buckingham had seen, or Hilker had seen on television or something like that in the 50s. And sometimes they didn't quite live up to what they looked like on TV. And anyway, they got a tenor up to play the lead in The Great Waltz, and discovered that he couldn't waltz. And I can still remember being in a car with Don Garrett and 3 or 4 others driving over to West Vancouver as the dawn came up, all exhausted, and E.V. Young was in the back saying, we're going to do the Merry Widow Waltz, and there won't be a waltz. He was crying. He was so upset when he discovered that there was no way they could do the Merry Widow Waltz. Anyway, no, I've got fond memories of those all-night sessions, very often with Bill Buckingham's wife, Doris, of course, who was a wonderful actress, and not a singer, but she belted out some good parts at Tuts, and was very well organized. Frankly, often better organized than Bill. And I'd sit with her out there at 3 in the morning while there were arguments going on stage about should we remove this bit of furniture or take that bit of scenery off, and Doris was always way ahead of them. She said, get rid of that one, and I said, you're right. Sure enough, it would go, but it always took longer. Doris was number one at knowing. I think if she'd been producing, she'd have been a great producer.
Instinct. Obviously, you were performing out in the natural nature.
Yeah.
Obviously, rain was a factor in a lot of this.
Oh, you'd spend all day long, if it was gray, staring at the sky, wondering now, are we going to go on or aren't we going to go on? And of course, there was the great business of, I can't remember when it started, this first tradition of handing out the butcher paper and that. I think it started with newspapers in the very beginning. And people started making paper hats because they would not go home. They'd sit there or they'd leave their seats and go under the trees to watch. And we'd be okay on stage. Mind you, the stage would be a bit wet. It wasn't easy for the dancers who were slipping and sliding on the puddles. And the orchestra was partially covered. And yes, the conductor, Harry Price or Bev Fife, who was alternate conductor at the time, as far as I recall, they used to stand there in their lovely white double-breasted suits with paper hats on in the rain conducting. The biggest problem for the orchestra, of course, was when it was raining, all the strings on the violins and that would go out of tune very quickly with the damp. And they were having to, between every number, they were having to retune all the stringed instruments. But it was quite depressing sometimes. But the audiences were amazing. They would stay and stay. And sometimes we'd go backstage and say, I wish they'd go home. And it would be wet down below, too. In the old dressing rooms, you'd have puddles all around you.
Not mention bathroom facilities either, for at least them anyway. For the,
At one time, I think a lot of them were in little huts out behind the mountain bowl. Yeah, there were little green painted plywood huts and that, and rather tricky.
There was a lot of loyalty amongst, some good stories, I guess, about some of the audience members who were very loyal to Tuts. And Miller was known for that. Yes,
well, she was one of many, but I've known her a long time. She was a volunteer here and still is. But people like Audrey would get the brochures and then plan their summer holidays from as far away as Winnipeg so that they could arrive here on a Friday and see the closing night of one show and the opening night of the next during their week off. And they'd take the train all the way back to Winnipeg or wherever. And I think she wasn't the only one, but she was one of the really loyal ones who came out year after year and wouldn't miss seeing at least 2 shows at Tuts every summer.
Besides, I guess, the rain, there were other natural occurrences that happened that were sometimes probably distracting to the performers.
Yes, well, one or two. I can't remember. I know there was one with Fraser Lister, but I can't remember that. But there was a production of New Moon where Sam Payne had to shoot Ralph Maggelson. Sam was the villain and Ralph Maggelson was the hero, and he was just off stage. And Sam raised his great 18th century, whatever it was, bang, and the 9 o'clock gun went off. And the audience applauded, and poor Sam thought, oh, come on, why are they applauding me shooting the hero? They should be booing. Another occasion, we did a production of The Student Prince, and Ernie Adams played Dr. Engel, and he has the lovely song about golden days. Well, now it has to start on a horn note from the orchestra. There's no intro. It just goes, boo, golden days. At the moment the oboe or whatever it was went boo, a ship was coming under the First Hours Bridge and went boo. And he sang Golden Days one key higher than the orchestra played it for the entire scene. And nobody realized he just picked up the wrong horn note.
And easy to do.
Oh, yeah.
I guess, I have a sense, I don't know, you know the story of whether it's actually true about the squirrel and Betty Phillips.
Oh, yes, I was there. They used to go around with butterfly nets trying to catch this squirrel every night. I was stage managing. I wasn't in the show. It was King and I. And every time she came on stage, and she'd sit on the floor, and all the little kiddies would come around her, and she'd sing, "Getting to Know You," and the squirrel would climb up the light pole over onto the stage and run around amongst the kids. It happened at least 3 or 4 nights, if not more, during the run of that show. They gave up trying to catch it.
Became part of the cast.
Yeah. It was really charming to watch. And Betty enjoyed it, and the kids loved it. It added a great deal to the performance.
Jimmy Johnston was there for years.
Yes.
I think he directed over 50 or involved in about 50 productions.
An enormous number of shows he did, yeah.
What are your memories of working with him?
A great many. I met him when he first came back from, I think he was studying in New York, and he was living up in almost the same part of Vancouver. Well, we were just over the bridge in North Van from where he lived. And my dad used to pick him up in the morning when Dad was driving to work, and he said, "Oh, I met this very charming young actor who's also a director. You'll have to meet him." Well, I did get to meet him, and then, of course, we worked a lot at Tuts. And I saw him in many things. One of the most wonderful roles he ever played was Og in Finian's Rainbow. He was the most delightful leprechaun you could ever imagine. And he played any number of very varied character parts. Of course, one of the great things is nobody was typecast in those days. You could play the limit, and that's something you can't do very often anywhere today. You know, few rare people get a chance to do it. But we were always doing different roles. Anything, any age, any size, any height, within reason. But and of course he directed so many productions. He was very adept and swift and thorough again as a director, technically extremely sharp, and his feeling for pacing sometimes overwhelmed me a bit as an actor, because I was an actor who was inclined to be a bit methody, even with a musical comedy, and I wanted to know what the character ate for breakfast, who he was married to, even if she wasn't in the show, and all this sort of thing. And that meant I developed a bit slowly. And when we were doing Brigadoon, I was playing the father of Harry, the boy who tries to leave Brigadoon and gets killed. And I only had about 15 lines, and I was determined I was going to make the most of them. And I even picked one of the older girls in the chorus and said, "Okay, now you're my wife." And we sneaked our way around during the rehearsals of the chorus stuff so that we would always be together, and we worked out our whole relationship with the boy and so on. Well, while I was doing all this, of course, I was taking my time with my lines, and I still remember Jimmy coming to be rather frustrated about a week before we opened. We had longer rehearsal for that one, and saying, "You know, either you've got to go fast or I'm going to cut some of those lines, Peter." I said, "I'll get it up to your pace, but give me another 2 or 3 days." And it all worked fine. But I just remember he just thought, "Oh, come on, don't drag your feet." But I wanted to get what I could out of a small role, which worked rather well, because Norman Campbell, who has now done so many marvelous things on television, he was still an English professor out at the university at that time, and he and his wife came to see Brigadoon, and I'd never met him. And he and his wife came backstage and particularly asked for me, and I said, "Yeah." He said, "I just wanted to tell you, you weren't seen stealing, but we couldn't take our eyes off you in that big sword dance scene, you and whoever was your wife. Your concentration and your fear that your son was going to be hurt was so amazing to see just among the background." So I thought, well, I guess I did something right. I say Jimmy and I remained, very good friends. Did a lot of radio together too.
We'll talk about that. Oh, change. Okay. I wanted to. I was talking about Jimmy, so I was just thinking, what else? Well, it was interesting for me because one of the things I wanted to do is touch on Bruno a bit because I don't have the opportunity anymore. But
right.
It was surprising to see that he actually was in a Tuts for Carousel, in that he's not renowned for his voice, I don't think, in terms of singing.
No, but he was fabulous in Carousel. I remember him very well. I've never seen a jigger, and I've seen several productions of Carousel, including the movie. No one, I don't think, has ever touched how wonderful he was as jigger. But he did other smaller roles. I have a photograph of him somewhere at home playing an Italian waiter. I think it was in Song of Norway, yeah, and there's a scene in a restaurant, and he's dancing with the dancers in a ballet, a comic ballet, but he was excellent in that. And he certainly didn't sing, but that was a great advantage, playing a role like Jigger. I thought he was just wonderful in that.
We'll get back to him, but keeping along the...
Can you just do one thing? I'll have to take off. Thank you.
Just thinking of his cohort in the Beachcomber, Dorothy Somerset, was also he did a number of shows with Tuts.
Yeah, well, Bob Clothier and I started out through Joy Coghill. We were in a production of School for Scandal at the university that went on a tour of BC with the Players Club, and somehow out of it, and I'm not quite sure, Bob and I ended up in this production of Florodora in 1948. And at that time, Bob, of course, people who only know him as Relic have no idea what man is really like. At that point, he had a wonderful raff moustache and a great big khaki greatcoat that he wore, and had a very British accent, as he had been involved with the British Army just toward the end of the war. And I remember we drove over to Victoria when we took Florodora over to Victoria in his little red MG, or maybe it was a green one, and that was his first show. I don't know whether he did others with Tuts, but we were both in that together after doing School for Scandal, and then later we did a lot of shows, of course, at the Freddie Wood together, Mrs. Warren's Profession and other things. And I had a series on television called Captain Peter and Timothy T. It was Javanese shadow puppets, and I played this old sea captain and told the story and played all the voices of these various characters in the stories I told that were played by the puppets. And when I went to England in '55, the show was still going on, and so Bob came on the show 2 weeks before I went to England as my first mate. And then when I went to England, he took over the show for the next year as Captain Peter's first mate, telling the stories.
And what did the people know? What did the audience, what were they told about Captain Peters? Was he had he gone on a trip or something? Or?
Yeah, he'd gone off on an exploratory trip looking for buried treasure and left his first mate there to entertain the kids.
While we're on the topic of radio, we might as well stay with it for a little while, and maybe you could tell me what it was like in radio in those early days, in terms of I guess maybe start with some of the important players like Andrew Allen and people like that.
Yes, well, I missed the early days of Andrew Allen. I did catch up with him in Toronto, I'm very glad to say, and worked with him at least once. But of course, he was one of the moving forces behind the stage series, but also, of course, when he first came out from England, he got his repertory company together, and all these wonderful actors from Vancouver, most of whom ended up in Toronto when he went to Toronto. And I used to listen to all these shows when I was a teenager, and never thought I'd ever get involved, but I did eventually. And but by the time I did radio, Archie McCorkindale, I believe, was the director, just after I got out of high school, and there was Robert Allen, and two or three other radio directors, Ray Whitehouse. So many of them eventually, of course, were sort of bumped up behind desks in Toronto when they should have still been directing. However, I did get a chance to do an enormous number of radio shows in Vancouver when I came back from Pasadena after I'd had my 2 years training there. And that's when we were doing school broadcasts in the morning and marvelous 1.5 hour broadcasts. I remember one, it was Alexander Mackenzie's Diaries, and it was an 1.5 hour broadcast, and I got a chance to play Alexander Mackenzie for Ray Whitehouse. And we worked on it over a period of a week. And what got us was Ray Whitehouse, the director, had to fly to England on some business and then come back for the final dress rehearsal on the following weekend and the performance. And there we were giving the story of Alexander Mackenzie's trip across Canada that took months and months and months and months. And there we did it in 1.5 hours, and in the meantime our director had flown to England and back while we were working on the show. And it sort of put something in a strange perspective. But they were wonderful shows.
What were some of the challenges of working in that medium in those days?
Well, it was the live thing, of course, as it was with television in the beginning, and that, you know, it was really like an opening night, you know. You were so nervous and so excited when that light went on, and you thought, my God, we're here for the next 1.5 hours, coast to coast, and there's going to be no way if you fluff or make a mistake that we can stop. And of course you had live orchestra with you in the same studio. It was a big studio in the old Hotel Vancouver before they built the big new facility. And it was incredibly exciting. It really was. And you didn't have that much rehearsal. You had to be very quick, and your scripts were very carefully marked. I've seen a reproduction of one of John Rainey's scripts. I think it's in the book his daughter wrote about him. And the markings in it, you can hardly read the words for markings that go up, down, 1 line, 2 lines, for pauses and so on, because there was no way you could have it all memorized. And but just to have a live orchestra with you and live sound effects, everything was right in the room with you, was really exciting.
Were there any evenings when it didn't quite run as smoothly as one would have?
Oh, things happened. One actor who was quite famous for being a bit forgetful had a big scene near the beginning of a 1 hour show, and he had an appointment for something. He was doing a concert that night or something, and he thought, well, I've done my scene, and whipped out of the studio, got into his car, and started to drive to the next place he had to be, and thought, oh my God, I've got another scene in 15 minutes. And he double parked outside the Hotel Vancouver, ran in just in time to do his second scene. And there's a very famous one with Lorne Greene in Toronto during the war. I've only heard this. They have a recording of it where Orson Welles was doing a big bond raising program with things he had to read. And he was late getting to the studio in Toronto, and Lorne Greene was on the show. And of course, he had this wonderful voice anyway. And when the scene came up, there was no Orson Welles, and Lorne Greene did the first scene doing the voice of Orson Welles. At the end of the first scene, there was a big musical interlude. Orson Welles walked in, took over the rest of the show. And I've heard the tape, or whatever it was, the recording they made in those days. It was remarkable. Lorne Greene was Orson Welles on that broadcast, and nobody knew until many years later.
That's great. When did keeping in the mediums of, well, actually, why don't we keep with radio? Because I've been interested in your memories of the farm show with the Carson family.
Right. Now I heard it. I never did a farm show. I'd love to have done one, but that was basically, I guess, Jimmy and Dorothy and Bill Buckingham, I guess.
Yeah, I think so.
I'm not sure whether Jimmy's wife was in.
Yeah,
she was. Right. Anyway, they were that was it. They were those two couples, really, the Buckinghams and the Johnsons. We younger ones, well, we weren't that much younger, but the ones who were just coming in used to say, "Oh, the Lunts of Alfred Lunt and Lynn Fontana of Vancouver," which they were, of course. You know, two wonderful husband and wife teams. But well, I used to listen all the time, and I was always saying, "Oh, can't you write me?" And I'd just like to do one farm broadcast while it still goes. But I never made it.
There was so much going on, I guess, in radio those days. So many different shows that were being produced.
Yeah. Well, there were early shows with Bernard Braden, of course, who's also gone now. But Bernie, his dad was the minister of Ryerson Church in Kerrisdale. And I remember Bernie Braden when he used to entertain us at Sunday school when I was a kid. And he did a lot of early stuff, particularly, I think, with Fletcher Markle, who was another one who idolized Orson Welles, and he had this wonderful series called Imagine Please. I believe it started actually on CKWX in the mid-40s. And they used to get scripts from Samuel French and put together a 1-hour drama, you know, in 3 hours rehearsal with 2 books they had, you know. But no, they were really going at it. But Andrew, I think, was the one who really got it all organized. And then, as I say, he sort of took his company of actors, people like Sam and all, went to Toronto then and worked with him on the stage series there with John Draney,
Right.
who was, I guess, the greatest of them all. I was very lucky that when I was in Toronto, they were still doing some stage productions, not, unfortunately, by Andrew Allen, but Draney was in them, and I managed to get a few lines on a couple of the last and work with him, because I had met him in Vancouver earlier with World of the Wonderful Dark, of course, another story.
Well, why don't we talk about that? Because I've heard,
Right.
I've had that from a few people, and it's interesting to see from different perspectives. Barry Moore's talked about it, and
Oh, yes.
Liz Sinclair, of course.
Right.
And what are your memories of that production?
Well, I was glad I was in it, and that's where I first met Barry Morse and John Draney, and worked. Well, of course, Douglas Seal directed it, and I really got to know Lister Sinclair. I knew of him and I'd met him, but of course he was there during the summer when we were rehearsing it, and it was a strange thing because I don't know what Lister would say now, but at the time he said, "Well, I intended it to be a West Coast Native Indian production with Hamlet in mind, but with Barry Morse playing the lead, it turned out to be Richard III." And I think it was true. And a lot of us, Bill Needles and 2 or 3 others, Bob Clothier was in it too, and Ken Kramer. We kept finding we had fewer lines each week of rehearsal, and Barry Morse had more. But he was tremendous fun in it, and wonderful when we toured all through BC. He really kept the company in stitches. He was such a good-humored, energetic, marvelous person. And again, one of the people who was very kind to me when I went to Toronto and had to get started all over again in another city, who was full of ideas and suggestions and so on. And
the Georgia Theatre, the auditorium, was wasn't what you'd call your first choice.
Oh no! Well, it was a sort of a wrestling arena originally, but it was sort of, there were seats on 3 sides, but it had a tin roof, and if it rained, you could hardly hear yourself speak on stage. And of course the dressing rooms were dreadful and so on. And of course with things like World of the Wonderful Dark, everybody was, all the native Indian types who were wearing loincloths were all painted in what they called Dallas dirt. It was kind of a luminous orangey brown material that they got from somewhere, I presume, in Texas. And everybody was rubbed down with all this stuff, and they looked absolutely marvelous. It glowed. But of course there were red handprints all over the dressing rooms, not only at the Georgia Auditorium, but the Royal Theatre in Victoria when we played here, and right throughout BC. And Marcel Marceau was following us in the Georgia Auditorium with his clown white costumes. I remember he walked in and he said, "Will you please wash the walls? I don't dare touch anything."
You left your mark everywhere you went.
We did, definitely. And some of the kids were really naughty. They'd sort of stand on one another's shoulders and rub their hands in it and put prints on the ceilings 10 feet up. Some of them may still be around.
How did it was the Vancouver International Festival.
Yeah.
Do you remember why that came about?
Yeah, Dorothy Somerset told me things I didn't even know when I had a long chat with her before she died. I'd come back from England, and Dorothy was instrumental in bringing me back from England because they were going to do a production of The Tempest with an all-Vancouver cast, but directed by Douglas Seal from the Old Vic. And she wrote to me and said, you know, would you be coming back to Vancouver, because I'd like to have you play Prospero in The Tempest. And I thought, well, I've been trying to see Douglas Seal at the Old Vic for the last 2 years in London, and I can't get to see him, so I said, yes. And so I came back, and we did that. And I didn't know at the time that it was a pilot for the Vancouver International Festival. And we did the Tempest, and oh dear, there was a production of Everyman and a number of concerts, and Robert Gill came out during that period from Hard House and directed a number of operas in the summer. But anyway, it was, I found out later that they were checking out Vancouver with this program, and then of course Nicky Goldschmidt became totally involved and became the overall director for the International Festival the next year, which was World of the Wonderful Dark, and of course Joan Sullivan's debut in Don Giovanni with George London and company. I've noticed so often listening to interviews with her, she never mentions that particular production. And I used to drive in the same car with her. A friend of mine was stage managing, and he'd drop her off at the Orpheum Theatre for her rehearsal and drop me off for World of the Wonderful Dark, and there'd be the dame in the back seat. She wasn't yet, but she was tremendous fun. And it was a beautiful production. Don McManus was in it, who's still performing all over the place. And Leopold Simonol and his wife. It was a beautiful, beautiful production. But anyway, that was the beginning of it all. And then, of course, I was sort of gone away after that again, and I missed most of the other festival performances, except off and on when I came back to Vancouver.
Going to go back a couple more things about Tuts, and then I don't go into total, I think, and then onward. But I was just curious, Robert Goulet was there for, I guess, a while, and it just
yes.
I guess he was in Finian's Rainbow and South Pacific.
Right. Now, I saw him in one of the shows, but I can't remember which one that I saw him in. I think he was there more than one summer. He must have been, because one of the summers I was definitely in the East, and I remember the next summer seeing him in one of his productions there, and meeting him and talking to him in his dressing room afterward. And that was the first time I'd met him. I'd seen him when he was a straight actor. Of course, he did a lot of straight TV drama in the early days in Canada, and of course he was also on a big musical show. And but I can't remember which show I saw him do. I did meet him later at Stratford, which was rather interesting. Jack Creeley, one of the actors there, was a friend of Bob's, and he dared him to come down to Stratford to a party one night after one of the opening shows. And at that time, Goulet was rehearsing for Camelot. And so he was feeling very out of place. He didn't know anybody except Creeley, and we had met once. So I sat in a corner and talked to Bob Goulet and said, "How are rehearsals going?" And he says, "I'm in this dreadful musical called Camelot. It's never going to go. It's terrible. I hate it. I wish I could get out of it." On it went. Of course, a few months later, it made him an international star. And of course, recently, he's been playing King Arthur very successfully 30 years later. But I found him, I'd like to say it about him, because some people have thought he's a bit of an ego. I found him, in the few meetings I had, to be the most diffident and thoughtful and rather shy person who never showed it on stage, but personally was very much not the Goulet that one sees as a star image.
One of the things I sort of skipped over, I wanted to talk to you about, was the Dominion Drama Festival. Because it's very important, I think, to talk about its role in supporting, and not only supporting the arts, I guess, locally, but allowing people to gather together from other parts of the country. Oh yeah. No, it was very important. I was only involved twice. Earlier on, there was a production directed by Elsie Graham of The Little Foxes. This is pre-Totem days. And Doris Buckingham played Regina, the lead, and I played Oscar, the same role I played later, the nasty brother. And it was entered in the Dominion Drama Festival. And the same year, Sidney Risk entered Andre Aubet's Noah, with John Milligan playing the lead from the little Everyman Theatre. Well, of course, Elsie Graham and Doris Buckingham and company had the facilities of Theatre Under the Stars workshops and everything, and there was this gorgeously costumed and set show, and the adjudicator gave the award to the Sackcloth and Ashes group, and I was so pleased for them, because I was on their side, because they were the ones without the budget and the real ones who were just beginning. Whereas, as the adjudicator said, he said, "Mrs. Buckingham and your friends, you are what I call halfways. You are not amateurs. You may not be professionals with a union card, but I feel that you really shouldn't be at this point in the Dominion Drama Festival." I said, "Here." Mind you, it was fun to do. Then later I directed a production of Volpone, which that's where I first met Herbert Whittaker. He'd done this wonderful production of Family Reunion, and we both won for our particular provinces and ended up in Victoria at the, I think we played the Royal. But again, it was that wonderful thing, and in Winnipeg later, I wasn't involved in the festival, but it was held there, and you got to meet people from every province, from coast to coast. And I mean, people like Dan MacDonald, who had also worked in Vancouver but was from the Maritimes, he'd given up theatre and had gone back to the Maritimes, and he ended up being cast as Oswald in a production of Ibsen's Ghosts, and ended up in Toronto as part of the festival, the Dominion Drama Festival, and out of it he was offered an apprenticeship at Stratford. And his boss in Halifax said, "Well, take it." And so he got back into the theatre, and he's never looked back. But it came through that production in Toronto. So it's a kind of a hit and miss thing that I remember, but I just remember it was that wonderful thing of going to all the cast parties after every show and meeting all these actors that you would never get to meet at any other time. It was that when you were doing Volpone that you also encountered some very good theatre from Quebec.
Oh, yes, right. That's when the young company from Quebec shot us all down in flames with a new play, and the title I've forgotten, but it was a contemporary show about kids on the street in Montreal, I presume it was, but somewhere in Quebec. And it came on the last night, and the adjudicator said, "Whoops." He said, "I thought I had everything worked out." And he gave the awards to this group for its fresh and exciting modern approach to the whole thing. And we were all doing familiar classics, and this young group just blazed across the sky that night. It was great.
During the 50s was the reign of the Totem Theatre, and
yeah.
What were your impressions when you first met Thor?
Well, I'd known them from when I first came back from California, and they were involved with the Vancouver Little Theatre at that time, and I was working with a community theatre in North Vancouver, and we all got to know one another, and then they were doing some shows with Yvonne Firkins, who had started a small arena theatre prior to Totem days, and they were involved in that. It was a production of Light Up the Sky. Again, all these productions are very associated also with Dorothy Davies. Anyway, the boys were doing promotion and publicity basically for them, and I had started this small operatic theatre, and so I offered them, I think it was, if they'd sell the ads for the program, they could have 50% of the proceeds. We were all needing money in those days, and so they worked with me on that, and even at Theatre Under the Stars, when they were just getting things organized, I used to split some of my pay when I was working on stage management and props, and in Thor and Stewart as a team, because they were called the Gold Dust Twins in those days. They were down helping me make props for an extra few bucks. And then, of course, they have also worked with Sidney Risk and the Everyman Theatre. So we all sort of knew one another, even though we hadn't worked in productions necessarily together. And then when they got going on the plans for Totem in West Van, I was with Tuts that summer, and a very good friend of mine, an architect, stage designer, Derek Mann, was their stage designer for the summer, and it sort of worked out that I could do a couple of shows at Theatre Under the Stars and go over and do Born Yesterday in West Van outdoors with them. And then, of course, they eventually, the ballpark thing, of course, it was okay, but it was very tricky, and of course they were absolutely brilliant, the way they conned people out of lumber and lighting equipment and all kinds of stuff. I don't know how they did it, because they were in their early 20s, and the energy and drive, and not only the fact that they were running the theater, they were also acting in the shows. And Norma McMillan, of course, Thor's wife, was their Girl Friday secretary in the office and playing many, many leads in the shows. And their hours were unbelievable. Talk about 24-hour days. I don't know when they slept. Well, a lot of the time I remember well. They were sleeping rolled up in blankets on the stage and that, you know.